There is a version of this man's story that most people skip straight past. Before the title, before the 50 undefeated battles, before Sword of Allah was ever spoken by anyone, there were years when Khalid ibn al-Walid was simply one of the most dangerous men in Arabia, and he was using every bit of that danger against the Muslims, not for them. This is the story of who Khalid was before Islam, not a footnote before the real story starts. 3 years, 2 battles, and a reputation that the Prophet Muhammad himself would later take seriously enough to want on his own side. To understand why that reputation existed, you have to start with where Khalid came from. He was born in Mecca, into the Banu Makhzum, one of the most powerful clans of the Quraysh tribe. His father, Al-Mughira, was among the wealthiest and most influential men in the city. And the Banu Makhzum were known for one thing above every other: excellence in warfare, horsemanship, weapons training, battlefield command. This was not a family that produced merchants or poets. It produced commanders, generation after generation, and Khalid grew up entirely inside that machine. Long before Islam existed as a movement in Mecca, he was already known across the city as an unusually gifted and instinctive military mind, the kind of young man that older, experienced warriors watched carefully, because they suspected he would eventually surpass them. Mecca itself in this period was not a quiet trading town sitting at the edge of the desert. It sat directly on the caravan routes running between Yemen and the Levant, which meant its most powerful families needed men who could protect wealth as capably as they could grow it. Being raised inside the Banu Makhzum meant being raised to think constantly in terms of formations, terrain, and timing, the same instincts that would later define every battlefield Khalid commanded, on either side of the conflict that was coming. His own cousin on his father's side was Abu Jahl, one of the most determined opponents the Prophet Muhammad faced in Mecca, which meant Khalid's opposition to the new message was not simply political or economic. It was woven directly into his own extended family, into the people he had grown up alongside and fought beside long before any of them had ever heard the word Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca, the Banu Makhzum, under men like Abu Jahl, became some of his fiercest and most organized opponents. Khalid grew up surrounded by that opposition, absorbing it as simply the way things were, the natural position of a family defending its status, its trade relationships, and its long-standing religious customs against a message that threatened to upend all three at once. And when armed conflict eventually broke out between Mecca and the young Muslim community in Medina, Khalid was already a grown man in his early 30s, already established as a skilled cavalry commander, already carrying the weight of his clan's expectations on his shoulders. His first confirmed battle against the Muslims came at Uhud in 625. And Uhud is the battle that historians, on every side of a story, still study today as one of the sharpest tactical reversals in early Islamic military history. Here is what happened. The two armies met on the plain below Mount Uhud, just outside Medina, with the mountain itself anchoring one side of the Muslim position. The Muslim army held a genuinely strong position for most of the early fighting, and by most accounts the battle initially went in their favor, with the Quraysh lines beginning to buckle and fall back toward their camp. Part of the reason the position held as well as it did was a small unit of archers posted on a hill overlooking the battlefield, given a direct and specific order by the Prophet himself. Hold this position, no matter what happens below, no matter which way the battle appears to be turning, no matter how tempting it looks to come down. For a while, that discipline worked exactly as intended, and it may well have been the single most important tactical decision of the entire battle. But as the fighting continued and the Quraysh lines broke and scattered, and Muslim soldiers began moving through the abandoned enemy camp collecting weapons, armor, and supplies, a large number of the archers on the hill became convinced that the battle was already decided. Believing there was nothing left to guard against, the majority of them left their post and moved down to join in gathering the spoils, leaving only a small handful behind to hold the position their commander had ordered them not to abandon. Khalid was commanding the Quraysh cavalry on the opposing side, positioned where he had a clear line of sight to that hill, and he was watching it closely, the way a trained tactician watches for exactly this kind of opening. He saw the gap form before almost anyone else on either side of the battlefield seemed to register what was happening. And he moved immediately, without waiting for orders from above him, without consulting anyone. He swung his horsemen around the now largely undefended flank and drove them directly into the exposed rear of the Muslim position, catching soldiers who believed the fighting was essentially finished. What had been, only minutes earlier, a clear and building Muslim advantage collapsed into chaos. The reversal was severe enough that the fighting reportedly came close enough to reach the Prophet himself, who was injured during the confusion, and the battle that had looked decided only a short while before was no longer decided at all. Hamza bin Abdul al-Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle and one of the most respected fighters in the Muslim community, was killed in the fighting that followed Khalid's charge, one of the heaviest losses of the entire encounter. What makes this moment worth sitting with is not simply that Khalid won a tactical exchange. It is the speed and clarity with which he read the situation, and the discipline it took to act on it instantly rather than hesitating even for a moment. This was not a prolonged strategic plan unfolding over days of preparation. It was a single window, open for perhaps a few minutes, that almost nobody else on the field seemed to notice in time. Khalid noticed it, and he acted on it immediately, while commanding men who were fighting for a religious and tribal cause he did not believe in, and at that point in his life, showed no apparent sign of ever intending to believe in. Modern military historians, writing from a purely tactical perspective with no religious stake in the outcome, still point to the Uhud flanking maneuver as one of the clearest examples in the early historical record of a battlefield commander correctly identifying and exploiting a temporary structural weakness in an opposing army. It is discussed in some contexts as a case study in situational awareness, completely independent of who was fighting for what cause. That is the level Khalid was already operating at, years before he ever picked a side that history would remember him for. Quick word before we continue. Getting the details of this period right takes real work, cross-checking claims that get repeated constantly online against what the actual classical sources say, and correcting details when the sources disagree or when a popular version turns out not to hold up. If that kind of care matters to you, consider supporting the channel as a member. And to everyone already doing that, thank you. This series only exists because of you. 2 years later, in 627, Khalid was present again, this time at the Battle of the Trench, also known as the Battle of the Confederates. A large coalition of Meccan forces and ally tribes, numbering by most accounts several thousand fighters, marched on Medina with the intention of ending the Muslim community there once and for all. Facing this coalition and heavily outnumbered, the Muslim community adopted a defensive strategy that was reportedly unfamiliar to the usual style of warfare practiced in the region at the time. Rather than meeting the Confederate army in open battle, where the numerical disadvantage would have been severe, they dug a wide, deep trench across the exposed northern approaches to the city, the one direction from which a cavalry assault could realistically be launched. The rest of Medina was naturally protected by rocky terrain and dense palm groves that made a mounted attack impractical. The trench itself effectively neutralized the Confederate cavalry's usual advantage in open warfare. According to the Sirah accounts, the idea for the trench came from Salman al-Farisi, a Persian companion of the Prophet who was familiar with defensive tactics used in his homeland, tactics that had simply never been employed in Arabian tribal warfare before. It is one of the details that makes the trench such an unusual battle in this whole story. Khalid was facing not just an unfamiliar obstacle, but an entirely unfamiliar approach to warfare itself, one that made centuries of established Arabian cavalry tactics largely irrelevant for the length of the siege. Khalid, commanding cavalry on the Confederate side, was among those who attempted repeatedly to find a way across it. Several crossing attempts were made at different points along its length, testing for narrower sections, softer ground, or any place where horses could realistically clear the gap and reach the other side. None of these attempts succeeded in producing a real breakthrough. The siege dragged on for roughly 2 to 4 weeks depending on the account, worn down eventually by a combination of the defensive terrain, a harsh windstorm that reportedly scattered the Confederate camp and extinguished their cooking fires, and the simple psychological toll of a prolonged siege that was producing no results for the attacking side, despite its numerical strength. Supplies ran low, tensions rose within the coalition itself, and the Confederate forces eventually withdrew without ever breaking through the defensive line. For Khalid personally, the trench represents something slightly different from Uhud. Uhud was a moment of brilliance, a single decisive read that changed the outcome of a battle already in progress, the kind of moment a commander remembers because he made something happen that nobody else on the field saw coming. The trench was different. It was a battle in which even a commander of Khalid's ability could not force a result that the terrain and the enemy's preparation simply would not allow. There is a particular kind of frustration in that experience, familiar to any skilled tactician. Skill alone does not always overcome a well-chosen defensive position, and the trench itself, however unconventional it may have looked to the Confederate commanders at first, turned out to be exactly the kind of obstacle that neutralized everything Khalid and the other cavalry commanders were best at. Speed, mobility, the ability to exploit a gap the moment it opened. All of it became far less useful against a static defensive line that simply could not be crossed by force. The siege also exposed something about the limits of the Confederate coalition itself, beyond anything Khalid could control from his position commanding cavalry. The alliance that marched on Medina was not a single unified army, with one chain of command. It was a coalition of Meccan Quraysh, allied Bedouin tribes, and other groups with their own separate interests and grievances, held together more by shared opposition to the moment than by any deep unity of purpose. When the windstorms scattered their camp and supplies began running low, that lack of cohesion showed. Different factions within the coalition began questioning whether the siege was worth continuing, and eventually the whole force withdrew, not because any single dramatic defeat had been inflicted on them, but because the coalition simply could not hold together long enough to outlast a defensive position it could not break. 3 major engagements now stood behind Khalid, spanning several years of continuous conflict against the same community. And in every one of them, whatever the ultimate outcome of the war itself, Khalid had proven, without any real argument left to make against it, that he understood the mechanics of combat as well as, or better than, almost anyone else fighting on Arabian soil in that period. Worth pausing on here, because it is one of the most commonly repeated mistakes about this period of Khalid's life. Many popular retellings place him at the Battle of Badr in 624, the first and most famous armed clash between Mecca and Medina, and describe him watching relatives die there. The earliest biographical sources do not support that. Khalid's own brother, Khalid ibn al-Walid, fought at Badr and was taken prisoner there, and it appears the two have simply been confused with each other in a lot of retellings that followed. The early Assyria literature is consistent that Khalid's first battle against the Muslims was Uhud, not Badr, 3 years earlier. It is a small correction, but it matters, because getting the sequence right changes how you understand everything that follows. Khalid did not spend 3 battles building toward Uhud. Uhud was where he arrived already fully formed. And yet, at this point in the story, nothing has changed in him. He is still entirely and without reservation an opponent of the message being preached in Medina. He has spent years fighting against it with real skill and real conviction. There is no indication in the historical record of any doubt creeping into his position during this period. No private moment of hesitation recorded from these years. No whispered second-guessing passed down through any chain of narration. Whatever second thoughts eventually reached him did not arrive yet. Not at Uhud. Not at the trench. If anything, the years following the trench seem to have been ones of continued, uncomplicated opposition. He is not recorded as attending peace talks with any sympathy for the other side, not recorded as showing mercy in battle out of any hidden sense of kinship with the cause he was fighting. He fought the way a fully convinced man fights, because that is exactly what he was. What makes this stretch of his life worth telling on its own, separate from the story of his conversion, is precisely that lack of foreshadowing. It would be easy, looking backward from everything Khalid became, to tell this part of his story as though every battle was secretly building toward the moment he would switch sides, as though some quiet crack was already visible if you looked closely enough at the right moment. That is how these stories usually get told in hindsight, smoothed over, so the ending feels inevitable from the very beginning. But that is not what the sources describe, and it is not the story worth telling here. What they describe is a skilled, committed, entirely convinced opponent, doing exactly what his clan, his upbringing, and his own convictions expected of him, with no indication whatsoever that anything was about to change. That matters, because it means whatever eventually did change his mind had to be strong enough to move a man who was not already halfway there. Not a man drifting toward a decision he was already leaning into. A man who had spent years actively, effectively, and successfully fighting against the very thing he would later be remembered for defending more completely than almost anyone else in early Islamic history. It is tempting, telling this kind of story, to smooth the edges of it, to hint at cracks that were not really there yet, because we already know how the story ends. But treating this period honestly means resisting that temptation. The historical record does not describe a man secretly wavering. It describes a man winning. There is also something worth considering about why these years matter beyond simply setting up what came later. A conversion story only carries real weight if the person converting had something real to walk away from. If Khalid had been a mediocre fighter, a minor figure on the edges of Meccan society, his later transformation into one of history's most consistently successful commanders would be a strange, almost accidental turn of events. It would not tell you much about conviction, because there would not have been much to convict. But that is not the man these two battles describe. These two battles describe someone at the very top of his field, respected, feared, and completely secure in his position and his beliefs. Whatever eventually reached him did not find an empty space waiting to be filled. It found a fully formed, deeply convinced opponent, and it changed his mind anyway. So here is where this chapter of his story ends, deliberately, without resolution. 3 years. 2 confirmed battles. A reputation built entirely in opposition to the message that would eventually define the rest of his life. No letter yet. No conversation with a brother who had already crossed over. No title. Nothing pointing forward. Just a man at the height of his skill, fighting for the side he was born into, giving no outward sign that anything was about to change. What happened next and why is a different story, one that deserves its own telling rather than being folded into this one as an afterthought or a quick epilogue. For now, this is where we leave him. Not yet a companion, not yet a convert. Simply one of the most dangerous men in Arabia, doing exactly what everyone around him expected him to do, with a skill that even the people he was fighting against could not deny. If this gave you a clearer picture of who Khalid was before everything changed, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Leave a comment if there is a detail from this period you would like to see explored further. And share this with someone who only knows the second half of his story. Thank you for watching, and until next time.